Nós vamos dar continuidade agora ao evento com a palestra do professor Shane Denson. Ele é da Stanford University, do Departamento de História da Arte, Mídias, etc. E vocês vão ter que me desculpar hoje, porque eu não estou num dia muito legal. Então, vamos dar continuidade com a conferência do professor. Tá?
Organizing everything, and thanks for coming out and for being interested in this. I hope that this opens up conversations. I don't pretend to have the final word on any of this stuff. What I'm trying to do, I think, is an intervention in between cinema and new media and philosophy, and yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. So today I'm going to be speaking about contemporary digital era cinema, or post-cinema for short. I feel like I'm a little bit short. Is this okay? It's still working? All right. So recognizing that this notion, like many such post-concepts, like postmodernism, things like that it's a contentious term that can be contested and problematized from a variety of angles, I'm going to be arguing that post-cinema indeed describes very real changes in the way that moving image media present themselves to our experience. So in this talk, which will be divided into 6 parts, I will be exploring post-cinema from the perspective of this experience, from our experience of moving images, and by way of situating that experience in the context of a new media regime. I'm going to explicate the latter in terms of the way that contemporary moving images mediate between us as viewers and an environment that is restructured by new computational technologies. I'm going to show that post-cinematic images are, in an important sense, severed, or as I call it, discorrelated from human perception, but that the algorithmic processes to which they are tied have a significant material impact on our experience of and our situation within a hyper-informatic environment. So, part 1, a prologue. Before I develop my argument, let me clarify what exactly is at stake in a discussion of post-cinema. As will be evident by now, post-cinema, in my usage of the term, is not exactly the same as digital cinema, which I take to be narrower in scope than the more inclusive post-cinema. In other words, post-cinema describes the larger media environment within which digital cinema operates. Nevertheless, I retain the term cinema in naming this broader environment, and I accord a central role to recognizably cinematic texts and phenomena in my explication of post-cinema, even though the new media regime that I intend with this term is one that contains not only cinematic, but also televisual, ludic, networked, and a variety of other contemporary media forms. The paradox here is not unrelated to the conceptual difficulties that we have with notions like digital film or digital cinema. Our uncertainty about whether such terms still describe cinema, much less film, is indicative of a larger media historical transition in the midst of which we find ourselves today. The idea of post-cinema is an attempt to describe this transition with a view to the larger media ecology within which those narrower terms are situated. So why do I continue to privilege the cinematic? In part, this has to do with my own training and disciplinary background in film studies, among other things. This announces itself, for example, in the title of a collection that I co-edited called Post-Cinema, Theorizing 21st Century Film, which came out in 2016. It's an open access book, and so you can all read it for free on the internet. Most, but not all, of the contributors to the volume approached the topic from a similar background in film studies, even though we were grappling with issues that might arguably be dealt better with under the rubric of new media. But there's good reason, I contend, to privilege the cinematic or quasi-cinematic in our attempts to understand our current transitional moment. Above all, this has to do with the position of cinema as the dominant media of the 20th century. It's against this position of dominance, both cultural and perceptual, that we must measure the current transition, and so it makes sense both conceptually and methodologically to approach our contemporary media environment as an emphatically post-cinematic one. In other words, to employ the term post-cinema is to describe a broad historical transformation, and it's in this regard that we find another advantage of the term. For rather than positing a clean break with the past, the term post-cinema asks us more forcefully than the notion of new media, for example, to think about the relation rather than the mere distinction between older and newer media regimes. Post-cinema is not just after cinema, and it's not in every respect new, at least not in the sense that new media is sometimes equated with digital media. Instead, it's the collection of media and the mediation of life forms and perceptual forms that follows the broadly cinematic regime of the 20th century, where following can mean either to succeed something sequentially as an alternative or to follow suit as a development or a response in kind. Accordingly, post-cinema marks not a caesura, not a clean break, but a transformation that alternately abjures, emulates, prolongs, mourns, or pays homage to cinema. Consequently, post-cinema asks us to think about new media not only in terms of novelty and their newness, but in terms of an ongoing, uneven, and indeterminate historical transition. The post-cinematic perspective challenges us to think about the affordances and the limitations of the emerging media regime, not simply in terms of radical and unprecedented change, but in terms of the ways that post-cinematic media are in conversation with and are engaged in actively reshaping our inherited cultural forms, our established forms of subjectivity, and our embodied sensibilities. There are a variety of perspectives from which we might approach these transformations, for example, by way of the technologies, the politics, the archaeologies, or ecologies of post-cinema, to name just a few of the rubrics that structure the contributions to the edited volume. In the following, I'm going to draw on some of these perspectives, but my overarching concern is to describe the medial ontology of post-cinema. So part 2, the argument. In this section, I'm going to explicate the experiential structures and relations of post-cinema. In particular, I want to point to the emergence of what I'm calling discorrelated images, images that operate outside of visual or even perceptual registers, and that impinge upon us at a microtemporal level of embodied temporal becoming. I'm going to connect my observations to empirical and phenomenological developments surrounding contemporary image production and reception, but my primary interest lies in a more basic determination of affect and its mediation today. Following philosopher Henri Bergson, affect pertains to a domain of material and spiritual existence constituted precisely in a gap between empirically determinate actions and reactions, or, with some modification, between the production and reception of images. Affect subsists, furthermore, below the threshold of conscious experience and the intentionalities of phenomenological subjects, including the producers and viewers of media images. It's my contention that the infrastructure of life in our properly post-cinematic era, and in what I'm referring to as a hyper-informatic environment, has been subject to radical transformations at this level of molecular or pre-personal affect. And I suggest that something of the nature and the stakes of these transformations can be glimpsed in our contemporary visual media. My argument revolves initially around what I'm calling the irrational or crazy cameras of post-cinematic media, following comments made by Therese Grisham in a roundtable discussion that we participated in together in the online journal La Furia Umana. So, seeking to account for the changed functions of cameras in the post-cinematic episteme, Grisham notes that whereas in classical and post-classical cinema, the camera is subjective, objective, or functions to align us with a subjectivity which may lie outside the film, there would seem to be something altogether different in recent movies. For instance, it's established that in District 9, the science fiction movie District 9, a digital camera has shot footage broadcast as news reportage. A similar camera appears intermittently in the film as a character. In the scenes in which it appears, it is patently impossible in the diegesis for anyone to be there to shoot the footage. Yet, we see that camera by means of blood splattered on it, or we become aware of watching the action through a handheld camera that intrudes suddenly without any rationale, either diegetically or aesthetically. Similarly, but differently as well, in Melancholia, we suddenly begin to view the action through a crazy handheld camera, at once something other than just an intrusive exercise in belated Dogma 95 aesthetics, and more than any character's point of view. So what is it precisely that makes these cameras crazy or opaque to rational thought? My answer, in short, is that they are fraught with perceptual paradoxes, vacillating indeterminately between the subjective and objective poles of perception. That is to say that post-cinematic cameras, by which I mean a range of imaging apparatuses, both physical and virtual, seem not to know their place with respect to the separation of diegetic and non-diegetic planes of reality, or between the narrative world and our world. These cameras therefore fail to situate viewers in a consistently and coherently designated spectating position. More generally, they deviate from the perceptual norms established by human embodiment, the baseline physics engine, if you will, at the root of classical continuity principles, which in order to integrate or suture psychical subjectivities into diegetic or narrative constructs, had to respect, above all, the spatial parameters of embodied orientation and locomotion, even if they did so in a very abstract and normalizing way. So breaking with these norms results in what I call the discorrelation of post-cinematic images from human perception. With the idea of discorrelation, I aim to describe an event that first announces itself negatively as a phenomenological disconnect between viewing subjects and the object images that they view. In her now classic book, The Address of the Eye, Vivian Sobchak theorized a correlation or a structural homology between spectators' embodied perceptual capacities and those of the film's own apparatic body, as she called it, which engages viewers in a dialogical exploration of perceptual exchange. Cinematic expression or communication, accordingly, was seen to be predicated on an analogical basis, according to which the subject and object positions of film and viewer are dialectically transposable. But, according to Sobchak, this basic perceptual correlation is endangered by new or post-cinematic media, as she was already calling them in 1992, which disrupt the commutative interchanges of perspective upon which filmic experience depends for its meaningfulness. With the tools that Sobchak borrows from philosopher of technology Don Eide, we can make a first approach to the crazy quality of post-cinematic cameras and the discorrelation of their images. So take the example of the computer-generated lens flare, the digital simulation of visible artifacts occurring in optical systems when light reflects from the lens surface. Such effects are featured ostentatiously in superhero films like Green Lantern or the Ghost Rider sequel directed by Neveldine and Taylor, who brag that their use of it breaks all the rules of what you can and can't do in 3D. Beyond the stylistically questionable matter of this excess, a phenomenological analysis reveals significant paradoxes at the heart of the CGI lens flare. There's a bird over here. So, on the one hand, the lens flare encourages what Don Eide calls an embodiment relation to the virtual camera. By simulating the material interplay of a lens and a light source, the lens flare emphasizes the plastic reality of pro-filmic CGI objects. The virtual camera itself is to this extent grafted onto the subjective pole of the intentional relation, embodied in a sort of phenomenological symbiosis that channels perception towards the objects of our visual attention. So this diagram symbolizes that the viewer and the camera, the virtual camera, are kind of symbiotically connected, and through the camera we perceive the simulated world, the world on screen, right? But it's through that camera that we look, just as we look through microscopes or telescopes or eyeglasses, right? They become invisible while we are using them. On the other hand, however, the lens flare draws attention to itself, and it highlights the image's artificiality by emulating and indeed foregrounding the emulation of the material presence of a camera. To this extent, the camera is rendered quasi-objective, and it instantiates what Eide calls a hermeneutic relation. We look at the camera rather than just through it, and we interpret it as a sign or a token of realisticness, like photorealisticness. The paradox here, which consists in the realism constituting and realism problematizing undecidability of the virtual camera's relation to the diegesis, where the reality of this realism is conceived as thoroughly mediated, the product of a simulated physical camera rather than defined as the hallmark of embodied perceptual immediacy. So this undecidability points to a more basic problem, namely to a transformation of mediation itself in the post-cinematic era. That is, the undecidable place of the mediating apparatus, whether it's on the subjective side or the objective side of perception, the camera's apparently simultaneous occupation of both subjective and objective positions within the intentional relation that it enables between viewers and the film, is symptomatic of a more general destabilization of phenomenological subject and object positions in relation to the expanded affective realm of post-cinematic mediation. Computational, ergodic, and processual in nature, media in this mode operate on a level that is categorically beyond the purview of perception, perspective, or intentionality. Phenomenological analysis can therefore provide only a negative determination from the outside, so to speak. It can help us to identify moments of dysfunction or disconnection, but it can offer no positive characterization of the molecular changes that are occasioning them. Thus, for example, CGI, computer-generated imagery, and digital cameras don't just sever the ties of indexicality that characterized analog cinematography. That's a kind of epistemological or a phenomenological claim. But beyond that, they also render images themselves fundamentally processual. They make images into processes rather than objects, thus displacing the film as object of perception and uprooting the spectator as perceiving subject, in effect enveloping both in an epistemologically indeterminate but materially quite real and concrete field of affective relation. Mediation, I suggest, cannot or no longer be situated neatly between the poles of subject and object as it swells with processual affectivity to engulf both. So compare in this connection film critic Jim Emerson's statement in response to debates over so-called chaos cinema, so basically like Michael Bay type action cinema with its shaky cameras and fast and arguably sloppy editing. So Jim Emerson writes, "It seems to me that these movies are attempting a kind of shortcut to the viewer's autonomic nervous system, providing direct stimulus to generate excitement rather than simulate any comprehensible experience. In that sense, they're more like drugs that ostensibly trigger the release of adrenaline or dopamine while bypassing the middleman, that part of the brain that interprets real or imagined situations and then generates appropriate emotional or physiological responses to them. The reason they don't work for many of us is because, in reality, they give us nothing to respond to, just a blur of incomprehensible images and sounds without spatial context or allowing for emotional investment." Now, I want to distance myself from what seems like a kind of blanket condemnation or dismissal of such stimulation. But I quote Emerson's statement here because I think it neatly identifies the link between a direct affective appeal and the essentially post-phenomenological dissolution of perceptual objects. Taken seriously, though, this link marks the crux of a transformation in the ontology of media, the point of passage from cinematic to post-cinematic media. Whereas the former operate on the molar scale of perceptual intentionality, the latter operate on the molecular scale of subperceptual and pre-personal embodiment, potentially transforming the material basis of subjectivity in a way that's unaccountable for in traditional phenomenological terms. But how do we account for this transformative power of post-cinematic media, short of reducing it to a narrowly positivistic conception of physiological impact? Part 3, the dilation of affect. In order to answer that question, it will be helpful here to invoke Mark Hansen's notion of what he calls atmospheric media, a concept that Hansen develops to explain the experiential impact of computation, of ubiquitous computation, but which builds upon Maurizio Lazzarato's theorization of an affective dimension of video technologies. According to Lazzarato, the video camera captures time itself, the splitting of time at every instant, hence opening the gap between perception and action where affect in Bergson's metaphysics resides. Because it no longer merely traces objects mechanically and fixes them as discrete photographic entities, but instead generates its images directly out of the flux of subperceptual matter, which it processes on the fly in the space of a microtemporal duration, the video camera marks a revolutionary transformation in the technical organization of time. The mediating technology itself becomes an active locus of molecular change, a Bergsonian body qua center of indetermination, a gap of affectivity between passive reception and its passage into action. The camera imitates the processes by which our own pre-personal bodies synthesize the passage from molecular to molar, replicating the very process by which signal patterns are selected from the flux and made to coalesce into determinate images that can be incorporated into an emergent subjectivity. This dilation of affect, which characterizes not only video, but also computational processes, like the rendering of digital images, which is always done on the fly, marks the basic condition of the post-cinematic camera, the positive underside of discorrelation. As Mark Hansen has argued, the microtemporal scale at which computational media operate enables them to modulate the temporal and affective flows of life and to affect us directly at the level of our own pre-personal embodiment. In this respect, properly post-cinematic cameras, which include video and digital imaging devices of all sorts, have a direct line to our innermost processes of becoming in time, and they are therefore capable of informing the political life of the collective by flowing into the general intellect at the heart of immaterial or affective labor. To make it a little bit more concrete, the Paranormal Activity franchise of fake found footage horror films makes these claims more concrete, more tangible, through a series of experiments with various modes and dimensions of post-perceptual affective mediation. After using handheld video cameras in Paranormal Activity 1 and closed-circuit home surveillance cameras in the second film, and following a flashback by way of old VHS tapes in Part 3, the fourth installment of the Paranormal Activity franchise intensifies its predecessor's estrangement of the camera from cinematic and ultimately human perceptual norms by implementing computational imaging processes for its strategic manipulations of spectatorial affect. In particular, Paranormal Activity 4 uses laptop and smartphone-based video chat and the Xbox's Kinect motion control system to mediate between diegetic and spectatorial shocks and to regulate the corporeal rhythms and intensities of suspenseful contraction and release that define the temporal or affective quality of the movie. And it's a horror movie, right? So it's supposed to keep us in suspense. And it does this through these technologies. Especially the Kinect technology, itself a crazy binocular camera that emits a matrix of infrared dots to map bodies and spaces and integrate them algorithmically into computational game spaces, marks the discorrelation of computational from human perception. The dot matrix, which you see here, which is featured extensively in the film, is invisible to the human eye. The effect is only made possible through a video camera's night vision mode, part of the post-perceptual sensibility of the video camera that distinguishes it from the cinema camera. The film, and the series more generally, is thus a perfect illustration for the affective impact and bypassing of cognitive and narrative interest through video and computational imaging devices. In an interview, co-director Henry Jost says the use of the Kinect, fittingly enough inspired by a YouTube video that was demonstrating the effect, was a logical choice for the franchise, commenting, quote, "I think it's very Paranormal Activity because it's like there's this stuff going on in the house that you can't see, so it's kind of ghostly, yeah." Indeed, the effect highlights all the computational and video sensory activity going on all around us all the time, right now, completely discorrelated from human perception, but very much involved in the temporal and affective vicissitudes of our daily lives through the many cameras and screens that are surrounding us and involved in every aspect of the progressively indistinct realms of our work and our leisure. Ultimately, Paranormal Activity 4 points towards the uncanny qualities of contemporary media, which, following Mark Hansen, have ceased to be contained in discrete apparatic packages and have become diffusely atmospheric. They're kind of floating around us all the time. This goes in particular for the post-cinematic camera, which has shed the perceptually commensurate body that ensured cinematic communication on Vivian Sobchak's model, and which, beyond video, is no longer even required to have a material lens, right? We talk about virtual cameras. They don't have a lens. This doesn't mean that the camera has become somehow immaterial. But today, the conception of the camera should perhaps be expanded even further than just the virtual one. Consider how all processes of digital imaging or digital image rendering, whether in digital film production or simply in computer-based playback on our own laptops and other computers, are involved in the same on-the-fly molecular processes through which the video camera can be seen to trace the affective synthesis of images from flux. Unhinged from traditional conceptions and instantiations, post-cinematic cameras are defined precisely by the confusion or indistinction of recording, rendering, and screening devices. In this respect, the smart TV becomes the exemplary post-cinematic camera, an uncannily flat domestic room composed of smooth computational space. It executes microtemporal processes ranging from compression, decompression, artifact suppression, resolution upscaling, aspect ratio transformation, motion smoothing, image interpolation, and on-the-fly 2D to 3D conversion. Marking a further expansion of the video camera's artificial affect gap, the smart TV and the computational processes of image modulation that it performs bring the perceptual and actional capacities of cinema, its receptive camera and projective screening apparatuses, back together in a post-cinematic counterpart to the early cinematograph, equipped now with an affective density that uncannily parallels our own bodily processing of space, time, and images. We don't usually think of our screens as cameras, but that's precisely what smart TVs and computational display devices in fact are. Each screening of a digital or digitized film becomes in fact a refilming of it, as the smart TV generates millions of original images, more than the original film itself. Images unanticipated by the filmmaker and not contained in the source material. To render the film computationally is in fact to offer an original rendition of it, never before performed, and hence to reproduce the film through a decidedly post-cinematic camera. This production of unanticipated and, in principle, unanticipatable images renders such devices strangely vibrant, uncanny, very much in the sense exploited by paranormal activity. The dilation of affect, which introduces a temporal gap of hesitation or delay between perception or recording and action or playback, amounts to a modeling or an enactment of the indetermination of bodily affect through which time is generated and by which, in Henri Bergson's system, life itself is defined. A negative view sees only the severing of the image's indexical relations to the world, hence turning all digital image production and screening into animation, not categorically different from the virtual lens flares that I discussed earlier. But in the end, the ubiquity of animation that is introduced through digital rendering processes should perhaps be taken even more literally, as the artificial creation of something like life, itself equivalent with the gap of affectivity, or the production of duration through the delay of causal mechanical stimulus response circuits. The interruption of photographic indexicality through digital processing is thus the introduction of duration, which is to say affect, which is to say life. Discorrelated images in this respect are autonomous, quasi-living images in Bergson's sense, having transcended the mechanicity that previously kept them subservient to human perception. Now instead they anticipate human perception. Apparently crazy because discorrelated from the molar perspectives of phenomenal subjects and objects, cameras now mediate post-perceptual flows and confront us everywhere with their own affective indeterminacy. Part 4, post-cinematic metabolism. Another way to say this, another way to put this, is to say that post-cinematic cameras and images are metabolic processes or agencies, and their insertion into the environment alters the interactive pathways that define our own material, biological, and ecological forms of being, largely bypassing our cognitive processing to impinge upon us at the level of our own metabolic processing of duration. Metabolism is a process that is neither in my subjective control nor even confined to my body as an object, but which articulates organism and environment together from the perspective of a pre-individuated agency. Metabolism is affect without feeling or emotion, affect as the transformative power of passion that Brian Masumi identifies in a Spinozan vein as that unknown power of embodiment that is neither wholly active nor wholly passive. Metabolic processes are the 0 degree of transformative agency, at once intimately familiar and terrifyingly alien, conjoining inside and outside, me and not me, life and death, old and novel, as the basic power of transitionality or change, marking not only biological processes, but also global changes that encompass life and its environment. Mark Hansen usefully defines medium as what he calls an environment for life, in order to foreground the infrastructural role of media in relation to the material powers of perception, action, and thought. Accordingly, metabolism is as much a process of media transformation as it is a process of bodily change. As Elena Del Rio has described it, the shift from a cinematic to a post-cinematic environment is a metabolic process through and through. Quote, like an expired body that blends with the dirt to form new molecules and living organisms, the body of cinema continues to blend with other image, sound technologies in processes of composition, decomposition, that breed images with new speeds and new distributions of intensities. End of quote. To the extent that metabolism is, as I've claimed, inherently affective, post-cinematic affect has to be thought apart from feeling, certainly apart from subjective emotion. What I've been trying to do is to situate us in a position from which we might grasp the image itself not as an objective entity, not as an object or even an objective process, but as a metabolic agency, one which is caught up in and defines the larger media ecological process of transformation that articulates and disarticulates subjects and objects, spectators and images, life and its environment in the transition to the post-cinematic. This metabolic image, I suggest, is the very image of change, and it speaks to a perspective that is the perspective of metabolism itself, an affect that is distributed across bodies and environments as the medium of transitionality. As I've outlined it here, this perspective builds upon a view of video and above all computation as technologies of microtemporal processing and modulation, but emphasizing this level of material technological functioning which subtends any identifiable content of mediation, points to the inadequacy of many of the more narrowly technical determinations of the transition to a post-cinematic regime. That is, many discussions concentrate on whether editing styles today are overly chaotic or whether they embody a merely intensified form of continuity, as David Bordwell has called it. But as Stephen Shaviro points out in his discussion of what he calls post-continuity, compliance or non-compliance with the rules of classical continuity is often simply beside the point in post-cinema. The central spectacle of Michael Bay's Transformers series, a series that is clearly full of hectic, non-continuity editing patterns, demonstrates this essentially secondary role of formal editing. The transformations themselves embody a certain outstripping of human perceptual faculties, discorrelations that are staged in continuous takes without the need for explicit violations of continuity. These transformations offer concise examples of a hyper-informatic cinema, They overload our capacities, giving us too much visual information, presented too fast for us to take it in and process it cognitively. Information that is itself generated and embodied in informatic technologies, operating at speeds well beyond our subjective grasp. Hence, the transformation's visualization does not simply produce images that give objective form to boys' and men's childhood fantasies and playtime imaginations. Instead, it is precisely their failure to coalesce into coherent objects that defines these images as metabolic spectacles beyond perspective. It's the processual flow and speed of algorithmic processing that is put on display here, and indeed put into effect as the images are played back on our computational devices. But so long as we underestimate the meaning of the image's animation, so long as we reduce it to a merely technical effect of CGI's severing of photographic indexicality, we fail to grasp the significance of post-cinematic affect as a more global event, an environmental shift, or a kind of climate change that is precipitated by the condensation and flow of affect in our increasingly lively machines. Through the discorrelating effect that post-cinematic cameras have on intentional relations, we as subjects are effectively consumed by or with and transformed along with the would-be objects of algorithmic images. We are bound up in and transformed by the processual experience of digital mediation, which, unlike the ideal closure of classical cinema, is proximal and open to, rather than separate from, our computational life world. In other words, there is no clear encapsulation of the movie experience from the digital infrastructures of our daily lives. There's contiguity, involvement, always an inescapable involvement that marks the participatory culture of the convergence era as far less benign than some critics might hope. Buy the game, buy the toys, download the app, watch it on Netflix, watch it at home, at work, on the train. At stake is a literal capitalization of our attention, and the hyper-informatic dissolution of perspective is central to this undertaking. Affecting us on a molecular, sub-perceptual level of microtemporal embodiment, but imbricating us in an expansive, diffuse network of nebulous agencies and transactions, the post-cinematic dispositif operates by metabolizing subject-object relations, transforming and recreating them by setting us and our affective machines in novel relations to one another and to the larger emergent flows of bits, bodies, and other material units of exchange. Part 5, the post-cinematic ecosphere. In a very different vein from the hyper-informatic spectacles of Michael Bay, Shane Carruth's 2013 film Upstream Color gestures towards the atmospheric and environmental aspects of post-cinematic metabolism, encompassing the sub- and supra-personal dynamics, the micro and macro levels, and confusions of within and without, in an audiovisual and narrative construct that displaces centered human perception in both directions at once. Upstream Color is about agencies that infiltrate the body, but that remain ecologically distributed throughout a network of hosts and environmental transport mechanisms. A river, plants, pigs, people, power lines, music, and money, all of these carry and are in turn carried by the parasitic maggots at the center of a story that is ostensibly about a couple ruined professionally, financially, and perhaps psychologically, as they find their way to one another and ultimately to a greater sense of connection with the world. I say that it is ostensibly about this, but it's certainly about much more than this. I hesitate to offer an interpretation per se of the film, as narrative and signifying functions seem secondary to the experience that the film propagates, both diegetically and medially, of indissoluble and multidirectional interlinkage. An experience, in short, of metabolism as the sub-perceptual nexus of growth and decay. I want to say that the film offers us an experience of metabolism itself and not a metaphor for metabolism. The basic affective tone of the film is alternately dark and hopeful, but it's not really about the characters or even our hopes or fears, it would seem. It feels more accurate to say that the film is simply about the material flows that it traces, which are marked as decidedly post-cinematic early in the movie. Without any sort of contextual situation, we're presented with this sequence of digitally composited images, complete with hexagonal lens flares and some sort of unfinished-looking CGI creature. These are then shown to belong to a diegetic screen, that of the female protagonist, Chris, who advances and reverses the images in a stepwise manner, clicking through the frames as she searches for a shadow or a gaffer's foot that apparently went unnoticed by the effects team of some production that's going on. If you've seen the film, you'll know that this brief scene, if indeed these images can be said to constitute a scene, that this scene is quite marginal in many respects. We will never learn about the project that Chris is working on here, and she'll be fired from her job anyway when a man feeds her the parasite, sets her in a hypnotic state for some indefinite number of days, and cleans out all of her financial assets. Yet the scene remains significant in situating the film in this context of computational labor and image production, where the human perspective that Chris brings and that we bring to these images is not central and focused, not the focusing vision that defines coherence in classical cinema, but a dispersed, scanning form of regard. The images compel us to interrogate them in this scanning manner. We scan the image for information to try to make sense of it. But we are unable to identify anything in the brief time that's given to us. In any case, Chris's vision is not a masterful or even directed gaze, but more of a stopgap designed to mop up around the post-cinematic vision machine. Chris herself embodies mere biopower in the service of algorithmic functions. Her infection with the parasite will extract her from this assemblage to a certain extent, but only by effecting a further splitting and dispersal of agency. Indeed, both Chris and the male protagonist Jeff, whom she is drawn to by some unknown force, and who has apparently undergone the same ordeal as she has, will more or less cease being individuals as their relationship develops. Their childhood memories merge, and it's unclear whose past belongs to whom. Moreover, this erasure of individual identity, or the overt emergence of what Gilles Deleuze calls dividuality, is mediated through free-floating dialogues that attach themselves to various locales and various times, impossibly bridging spatial and temporal distances that no embodied speaker could span. So what sometimes resembles a Terrence Malick-style voiceover is really something quite different, as it is occasionally anchored in an image of a character speaking, but that speaking character can disappear and reappear at a distant location within the space of a single ongoing dialogue, itself apparently presented in real time. We are in the realm of the virtual rather than the actual, it would appear, and the flow of images and sounds effectively involves the viewer in the dispersal of agency described in the diegesis. And it's the music above all. Oh yeah, good, I have sound. All right, I forgot about that. It's the music above all that ties everything together. Semi-diegetic in nature, the musical counterpart of a free indirect discourse. Perhaps the synthetic music weaves back and forth between the status of background music and source music. The sampler, as the unnamed character is called in the film's credits, synthesizes natural and technological sounds, running water, a drain pipe, the hum of a power line, into electronic music, effecting a sort of metabolic recombination of environmental materials. He sells his music on CD, but he also uses his sound compositions to attract the parasite's human hosts to a field where he extracts and transplants the worms into pigs. Playing simulated rain sounds on an amped-up PA system, the sampled sounds bypass the host's subjectivities, working on them subperceptually and impinging upon their bodies via the